Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you all here inside in the dark on a beautiful day. I'm Rebecca Long. I'm the Patrick G. and Shirley W. Ryan Curator in the Department of Painting and Sculpture of Europe, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you and to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Jenna Carvana. Before we begin, a brief reminder to silence your cell phones and any other beeping devices that you have with you. Jenna Carvana, our speaker for today's program, is Curatorial Associate in the Department of Painting and Sculpture of Europe here at the museum. Since joining the Art Institute in 2015, she has worked on a number of permanent collection research projects, and in addition, her research talents have been integral and invaluable for a number of recent exhibitions. The exhibition El Greco, Ambition and Defiance in 2020, Van Gogh and the Avant-Garde, The Modern Landscape, which just closed about a week ago, and our current exhibition, Among Friends and Rivals, Caravaggio in Rome, which she is speaking to you about this afternoon. Jenna received her Master's of Arts degree in Spanish medieval history from the University of Leeds in England, and she has held collection and curatorial internships in Leeds at the Royal Armories, as well as here in Chicago at the Museum of Contemporary Art and the Museum of Science and Industry. Please welcome me in inviting Jenna and welcoming Jenna to the podium this afternoon. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Oh, I love that. Thank you. Thank you for joining me for this afternoon talk on Among Friends and Rivals, Caravaggio in Rome. If you haven't seen the exhibition yet, this is a small-scale exhibition in Gallery 211 featuring two beautiful loans of paintings by Caravaggio, Martha and Mary Magdalene from the Detroit Institute of Arts, and the Card Sharps from the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. These two loans are installed alongside Caravaggesque paintings from the Art Institute's own collection to allow us to contextualize Caravaggio's works and, of course, his influence in Rome, but also to highlight and contextualize the works of his followers, which are regularly on view here in Chicago. Now, when I say that a work is Caravaggesque or in the style of Caravaggio, what do I mean? The artist is very much defined by the techniques that he popularized during the 14 years that he spent working in Rome. These include the interplay between light and shadow, a technique called chiaroscuro, as well as a raw naturalism that came from working directly from life. These techniques were used in his works depicting secular and religious subjects, which he reinvented, refreshed, revitalized, whichever you prefer, in order to make these subjects appealing to the Roman art market. However, as you'll see at various times throughout this talk, throughout his career, and particularly during his time in Rome, Caravaggio came to be known as much for his unruly behavior and actions and personality, certainly, as he was for the original and captivating painting style that so attracted patrons and followers alike. Born Michelangelo Merisi in Milan in 1571, Caravaggio's upbringing was actually fairly comfortable. We know for a fact that his father was a property owner with connections to the powerful Sforza family who once ruled Milan, and with whom Caravaggio would maintain connections even into his adulthood, and after his father's passing in 1577, when Caravaggio was about 6 years old. One outcome of having a privileged upbringing is the fact that Caravaggio was indeed literate. We know this because he has signed a couple receipts for his commissions and also owned a collection of books at the time of his death. But of course, at this time, this was a very rare quality, even for someone who's raised in a more comfortable situation as Caravaggio was. The family moved from Milan to Caravaggio, a town about 25 miles east, in 1576 to escape a plague that was ravaging the city. And it is from here where Caravaggio certainly grew up and where he received his nickname da Caravaggio, meaning from Caravaggio, as we know him today. In 1584, at the age of 12 or 13, he was apprenticed to the fresco painter Simone Petrozzano in Milan. A typical apprenticeship at this time meant that Caravaggio was living and working with Petrozzano and began with simple tasks such as cleaning, sweeping, what have you, working his way up to grinding pigments, and then eventually assisting with paintings themselves. After his 4-year contract was up, he began working as an independent artist in Milan, but following his mother's death, he sold the remainder of the family land in Caravaggio and moved to Rome in 1592. Now, I should note before I dive into my discussion of works by Caravaggio, the works that he produced in Rome, I should note that compared to how much we know about his 14 years in the city, we really don't know that much about his earlier and later career, basically the periods before and after his time in Rome. The reason for this is that Caravaggio's earliest biographers really only knew his Roman works and certainly knew them better than works produced in Naples and Malta, what have you. And they knew little to nothing about his upbringing. Although in the last 20 or 30 years, we've had access to a greater number of archival sources that have shed some light on these earlier and later periods, still, the number of documents that we have for the Roman period, the contracts, the lawsuits, the claims made against him, really give us the best understanding of who Caravaggio was and the types of works that he was producing. Now, when I hear the name Caravaggio, a still life is not the first thing that comes to my mind. I don't know about you, but certainly not the case for me. And in fact, there are very few still lives by the artist that are still known today. Similar to many of his other works, Caravaggio often produced these paintings without a contract or commission and then sold them through dealers. An important factor of Caravaggio's working method was looking directly at referencing his subjects directly from life without producing a preparatory drawing. And so we see here in this example from the Biblioteca Ambrosiana that the artist faithfully represents all the flaws in the fruits and the foliage, such as the apple with the brown spot and several damaged leaves. By working directly from life, Caravaggio was able to develop a striking level of realism down to the finest detail. And in this case, he elevated the genre of still life, which at his time was considered a lower art form when compared to other genres. Certainly more well known than his still lifes are Caravaggio's figures. And in fact, it was Caravaggio who is credited with introducing the half-length figural composition to the Roman art scene. Similar to his paintings of fruits and foliage, the artist did not idealize his figures in any way, but depicted them faithfully as they were, directly onto the canvas. The resulting works contain a striking level of detail, so much so that if a model were to arrive with dirt under his fingernails, Caravaggio would include this feature in his painting as well. Now, I should note, although he's focusing on figures here and portraying the people faithfully as they were, this doesn't mean that Caravaggio forgot about the inanimate objects in his compositions. He's noted to have stated that painting a still life requires as much artistry as painting a figure, and we certainly see that here in these two examples, especially the impeccable detail used in the foliage and the fruit. I'm particularly fond of the cherries in the foreground of a boy bitten by a lizard. They look quite delicious in my opinion. So with these figural compositions, Caravaggio started fairly small, if we'll say small. And by that I mean really beginning with individual figures. But he begins working on a larger scale, adding more figures and more complex compositions, such as we see here in the card sharps and Martha and Mary Magdalene. These works depicted innovative subject matter that appealed to the Roman clientele. But I noticed that in general, we can kind of lump these into two kind of broad spectrums: biblical narratives and tavern scenes. And now that I'm thinking about it, actually, these are kind of opposite ends of the spectrum, right? We'll start with tavern scenes because they're fun. But also because these are works that I think more accurately reflect Caravaggio as a person and as an artist. We know that Caravaggio was hanging around with prostitutes and gamblers in the seedy underbellies of Roman taverns. He's said to have carried a sword with him, a concealed sword, a weapon that was only allowed for nobility at this time, and he's documented as having been involved in several fights and brawls in Rome, in taverns and on the streets. In one particular situation, he actually assaulted a waiter who brought him artichokes that are prepared incorrectly. Now, I'm serious about my lunch, but that's a little extreme even for me. So in addition to introducing the half-length figural compositions to Rome, as I mentioned previously, Caravaggio also popularized these tavern scenes in Rome and beyond. Artists and patrons alike were very interested in the dynamic subject matter, particularly upper and lower classes interacting, or nobility and rogues, and I think that the card sharps is a fantastic example of this. This painting is an allegory of the dangers of gambling. I'm sure something the artist knew very well. Here we see two young men engaged in a game of cards, possibly primero, a forerunner of poker. The naive young man facing the viewer studies his cards carefully. This figure is undoubtedly wealthy, and we can tell this from his clothes. These dark garments and dark hat were very much en vogue for nobility and wealthier members of society, and they would have been made out of brocade or silk or velvet, luxury textiles at the time. The card sharps, or cheats, are dressed in much more lively, colorful, yet mismatched outfits. Caravaggio based their garments on costumes rather than clothing that people would wear in their day-to-day lives. For a 16th or 17th century viewer, this would have indicated that these two figures were on the margins of society, either as mercenaries, entertainers, or, in this case, some form of criminal. The artist adds additional clues that hint at the nefarious intentions of these two men, which we as the viewer can see, but the naive youth clearly overlooked. The first of these is that the man in the background has cut the fingertips out of his gloves, and he did this to enable him to feel for marked cards. The second clue is that the youth's opponent carries a stiletto dagger in his belt. This is a weapon that was outlawed in Rome at the time. Beyond the interesting subject matter and these subtle hints to the viewer, Roman collectors and artists alike were intrigued by the orientation of the composition, which makes the viewer part of the action, and also would become sort of a key component in many of the artist's work. Painted as if the viewer is standing at the table with the three men, we are able to see the sleight of hand that the youth cannot see from his position. The man in the background indicates the youth's next move to his accomplice, or by gesturing to his accomplice, who pulls marked cards from behind his back. By giving the viewer this particular vantage point, we're not only included in the scene and in the action, but were made implicit in this act of deception. Now, of course, working in Rome, artists were not only producing secular subjects, and Caravaggio addressed his religious narratives very much in the same way. He addressed his tavern scenes with their rogues and fortune tellers. We see this in one of his earliest half-length religious narratives, Martha and Mary Magdalene, on loan to us from the Detroit Institute of Arts. This painting shows the sisters, Martha on the left and Mary Magdalene at right, engaged in an intense dialogue. Martha is caught mid-sentence with her lips parted and her hands gesturing as she pleads with her sister to give up her life of sin and vanity. Mary, facing the viewer, turns her head towards her sister and appears to be listening intensely to what she has to say. Now, the figure of Mary Magdalene is a bit obscure because of the many Marys that appear in biblical literature. But in the 16th and 17th century, Mary Magdalene was known as or portrayed as a prostitute, and therefore, in biblical terms, as a sinner. Her sister, Martha, on the other hand, is regarded as living a much more pious life in comparison. Caravaggio's choice of clothing and accessories further highlight these differences between the sisters. Both women are dressed in contemporary garments, but Mary's clothing is much more lavish than her sister, and the embroidery contains significantly more detail. The objects surrounding Mary only heighten the difference between the two. A powder jar and comb on the table, and the convex mirror where Mary places her arm. This is a bit unfamiliar to us today, but a convex mirror such as this would have been an incredibly expensive luxury item at the time. All three of these objects represent vanity and luxury, and again, further highlight her perceived status as a sinner. Now, while the figure of Mary Magdalene represents sin and vanity, so too did she personify repentance and forgiveness. The scene shows her moment of conversion, a moment of self-reflection and realization, during which time she disavowed her previous life and actions to pursue a more pious lifestyle. Caravaggio's use of chiaroscuro, again, that interplay between light and shadow, helps to highlight this fact. The women are seated in a dark room, and while Martha, again, the more pious of the two, is shown relatively in shadow, Mary is illuminated by an unknown light source that is intended to represent divine grace. Looking again at the objects that surround her, we notice that although she possesses items that represent vanity, she is also holding an orange blossom, an object which was commonly associated with purity and moral virtue. As we saw with the card sharps, the arrangement of this composition invites the viewer into the scene, allowing us to sit at the table with the two women. By including the viewer into the work, and by depicting these biblical figures in contemporary attire, Caravaggio's composition provides a radical retelling of an established biblical narrative that made, in this case and with his other religious narratives, made this subject matter accessible, relevant, and exciting to Roman art collectors. I've spoken a bit about Caravaggio's smaller works, which would have been intended for private collectors. But he also received a few large-scale commissions while working in Rome. In fact, working in the city in the 1590s afforded him a particularly beneficial opportunity, not just for Caravaggio, but actually for all Roman artists at the time, because Pope Clement VIII had declared the year 1600 a holy year, during which time sins and punishment due to sin would be forgiven through the granting of indulgences. This came at a time when other European nations, such as Spain and France, were becoming increasingly powerful through their colonial holdings. The Holy Year encouraged pilgrimage to Rome and provided the opportunity to show that the city was still a central hub for international diplomacy and, of course, art. As a result, the city undertook extensive construction and renovation projects for palaces and churches, including St. Peter's, which in turn created immense competition among artists working in the city. Although Caravaggio had achieved a certain level of fame through his smaller compositions, which he sold through dealers, the Holy Year, the commissions that he received in response to the Holy Year really thrust him into the limelight for the very first time. In fact, one of Caravaggio's patrons who had purchased the card sharps from the artist interceded on his behalf to win Caravaggio the commission of 2 paintings for the Contarelli Chapel in San Luigi dei Franceschi. The 2 works, The Calling of St. Matthew and The Martyrdom of St. Matthew, are not only Caravaggio's first major commission, but also his first 2 works to depict more than just a handful of figures. The Calling of St. Matthew documents the moment in which Jesus, accompanied by St. Peter, calls upon Matthew, a tax collector, to follow him. As we saw with Martha and Mary Magdalene, this depicts a sort of moment of spiritual awakening, as it were. And Caravaggio's use of chiaroscuro helps to highlight that. And again, an unknown light source illuminates the faces of the men who are seated at a table in an otherwise darkened room. The Martyrdom of St. Matthew, on the other hand, shows the death of the saint, who, according to tradition, was killed while celebrating Mass, Mass at the altar because he had rebuked the niece of a king. The dramatic lighting utilized here highlights the soldier with sword in hand and the violence that he's inflicting upon the saint. Surrounding figures are illuminated a little bit, but just enough so that we're able to see their responses, their gestures, and their faces as they are witnessing this intense act of violence. Because this commission was for a church, these were paintings that were produced for a very public setting, and this project gave the artist greater visibility than he had had before. This visibility was the catalyst to his rise to fame in Rome and led to a series of prestigious commissions from wealthy and very important clients. Now, I mentioned earlier that Caravaggio was a bit unruly, and indeed he lived hard and fast in Rome, if I can be honest. But this lifestyle eventually catches up to him. In 1606, he is forced to flee the city because he kills a man during a duel. Now, dueling at the time was outlawed, so killing someone during a duel is a particularly heinous crime, suitable for law and order. As a result, Caravaggio flees the city and moves to Naples. He was convicted of murder in absentia and subject to a capital sentence, which basically meant should he return to Rome, anyone could kill him in return for a reward. So probably a good idea to stay away. The remainder of his life was filled with various misadventures that unfortunately, again, are not as well documented as this Roman period that we focus on in our exhibition. Caravaggio eventually travels from Naples to Malta, where he joins the Order of the Knights of Malta very briefly, probably thinking that being a knight in this order would help him sort of clear his name so he can return to Rome one day. True to form, he assaults a senior knight of the order, biting the hand that feeds him. So he is expelled from the order and briefly imprisoned, but is able to escape with the help of an accomplice. You really can't make this stuff up. He's able to flee to Sicily before returning to Naples in 1609, and by 1610, he's making his way back to Rome, believing that he'll be able to seek pardon because of some of the connections that he has in the city. But unfortunately, Caravaggio dies of unknown circumstances on his way back to Rome in 1610. However, Circling back to Caravaggio in Rome and to this particular exhibition, within the scope of the installation in Gallery 211, these special loans from Detroit and from Fort Worth help us to contextualize the Caravaggesque paintings in the Art Institute's collection. We're pleased to be able to install the loans in between paintings by three Caravaggisti, or followers of Caravaggio. I should note that although we refer to these artists as the Caravaggisti, we can't really consider them a unified group, or we can't consider Caravaggio's followers, that is, a unified group, because they all had different interests in and connections to the master. This fluctuation resulted in a lot of diversity in their works, but in general, these painters were drawn to the hallmarks of Caravaggio's style, such as his use of live models, his dynamic compositions, and of course, his dramatic lighting effects. The three works in this installation help to illustrate this variation. Located at the very center of the wall is the Resurrection by Francesco Bonueri. As you can see from the caption, Bonueri is also called Cecco del Caravaggio. While Cecco is a diminutive of Francesco, del Caravaggio suggests that there's some sort of personal relationship between Cecco and Caravaggio. Indeed, Cecco is one of Caravaggio's closest followers, and it's likely that he lived and worked in Caravaggio's studio and modeled for the painter during his last years in Rome. We don't really know much about Cecco. In fact, the Resurrection is his only documented work. It was commissioned in 1619 by the Tuscan ambassador to Rome for a family chapel in Florence. And we're not quite sure why. The documents don't really provide the details, but upon its completion in 1620, the work was refused. This is not an uncommon occurrence, of course. Rome had a rapidly changing art market, so this is not a situation unique to this work or to Cecco. The work eventually sold to Cardinal Scipione Borghese, nephew of Pope Paul V, and an avid art collector who possessed several works, those that you see on the screen, by Caravaggio, including The Sick Young Bacchus and David and Goliath. The Resurrection does owe much to Caravaggio, and we see Cecco mimicking the composition of twisted bodies set on a dark background, which Caravaggio uses in many of his larger compositions. He also utilizes the same unidentifiable light source that Caravaggio utilizes in the Contarelli Chapel Commission and also Martha and Mary Magdalene. However, where we see Caravaggio creating even his larger commissions, larger works as a cohesive piece, Cecco's composition appears a little bit more as though it's a collage, as if he worked with particular figures at one time and then added more figures at another time. So it's just simply not as cohesive as what we would expect from Caravaggio. Beyond Cecco's one degree of separation from Caravaggio, this work may have interested Scipione Borghese because it documents elements of a now lost altarpiece for the Fenaroli Chapel in Naples. But whatever his interest in the work, Borghese clearly appreciated the Resurrection, even if its original patron did not. Our next artist, whereas Cecco represents a student of Caravaggio, our next artist is more of a rival, thus the title of the show. Although slightly older, Giovanni Baglione was a contemporary of Caravaggio, and like many other artists working in Rome, he was profoundly, albeit very briefly, impacted by the unveiling of Caravaggio's Calling and Martyrdom of St. Matthew in the Contarelli Chapel in 1600. It's around this time that Baglione began working in the more naturalistic style with dramatic chiaroscuro, components that we do not see in his earlier works, such as the Dream of St. Joseph, shown here. Baglione was arguably one of the first artists in Rome to take such direct and obvious inspiration from Caravaggio. And in fact, we think that the Ecstasy of St. Francis, dated 1601, is his first Caravagesque painting. It incorporates the realistic figure types and the dramatic lighting, as well as the imagery of the swooning saint that we see in an earlier work of the same subject by Caravaggio. Baglioni's attitude towards Caravaggio soured pretty quickly. When Caravaggio was commissioned to produce Amore Victorious for the powerful banker Vincenzo Giustiniani. Caravaggio's playful yet provocative painting shows earthly love triumphing over liberal arts, power, and glory. This work would have been particularly controversial, a little spicy, because Caravaggio used the same young model for several of his religious compositions, but here he shows him depicted in a fairly sexualized manner, so there were definitely strong responses to this work. Unhappy, read probably jealous, with Caravaggio's success with such a powerful patron, Baglione produced a painting in response to Amore Victorious, entitled Sacred and Profane Love. And in this work, he uses Caravaggio's own style to satirize one of Caravaggio's work. Baglione's painting more closely reflects official church teachings at the time, and it aims for the submission of an earthly love, who we see here thrown onto the ground by the armored divine love. Adding insult to injury, Baglione sold this painting to Cardinal Benedetto Giustiniani, the brother of Caravaggio's patron. Benedetto awarded Baglione a gold chain for the work, but shortly thereafter, the work began to be heavily criticized by other artists, including our boy Caravaggio. And perhaps in response to these criticisms, Baglione produces a second version of the painting for his patron. The second work still shows the artist working in the Caravagesque style, but among the changes to the composition, we see this figure on the ground on the left has turned to face the viewer. Baglione modeled this figure after, guess who? How well do you think that went over, given what we know now? Tension, of course, did not end here, because in my opinion, these are fighting words. In 1603, Baglione completed a large-scale commission for an altarpiece. And shortly after the altarpiece was unveiled, a series of dirty limericks about him circulated through Rome. Among other claims, many, many other claims, the poems noted that Baglione was a terrible artist who did not deserve all of the notoriety and the commissions that he had received. Now, I won't read this out because it's actually a significantly longer limerick, but I should note that I only included the family-friendly version of the text. It took me about an hour to find a couple lines, consecutive lines that were appropriate to present because I like my job. So you can definitely imagine that these were quite dirty and very nasty. Believing, perhaps correctly, that Caravaggio was involved with the circulation and distribution of these poems, Baglione sued him for slander in 1603, but the trial ultimately fizzled out without reaching a verdict. I think it's pretty apparent from these incidents that Baglione and Caravaggio were not just contemporaries and rivals, but they just really hated each other. Perhaps because of this continued conflict, or as well as the rapidly changing tastes in the Roman art market, Baglione distanced himself from the Caravagesque style by 1603, as you can see in this comparison here. Even so, He includes Caravaggio in his Lives of Painters, Sculptors, Architects, and Engravers, which he published in 1642, and which provided significant information about Caravaggio's life. This also made Baglione one of Caravaggio's very first biographers, albeit a biased one. Our last work by our final artist, Bartolomeo Manfredi, represents the group of artists that came after Caravaggio in the years following his flight from Rome. Many of these artists, including Manfredi, likely only knew Caravaggio through his works rather than a direct connection to the artist himself, as we saw with Cecco and Giuseppe, or excuse me, anyway, Baglione, excuse me. Manfredi began his career in Rome by producing copies of celebrated works by Caravaggio. And we think that Cupid Chastised is likely a replica of a now lost painting of the same subject commissioned by Caravaggio's first major patron, Cardinal Francesco Maria del Monte. This painting incorporates figures from ancient Roman mythology to create an allegory of the eternal conflict between love and war. Mars, in red, the god of war, violently whips Cupid as punishment for embroiling him in an affair with the boy's mother, Venus, the goddess of love, who we see trying to stop the beating. With his detailed knowledge of Caravaggio's works, which again he achieved through copying Caravaggio's works, Manfredi carried forth the Caravaggesque style, assimilating and adapting different elements of the older artist's work, like the naturalistic portrayal of studio models, which, as we see here, he depicts in mythological roles, and of course the dramatic contrast between light and shadow. Just like the artist's career in the city, I should probably note that the Caravaggesque style burned fast and bright as well. It fell out of favor in Rome by 1630, so 20 years after the artist's death, and fell out of favor in the rest of throughout Europe by 1650. And this is really because tastes were shifting towards more classical and idealized imagery. Indeed, besides his earliest biographers, who wrote about Caravaggio in the decades following his death, you'll be surprised to know that Caravaggio was all but forgotten until about 1951, when an exhibition of his works were held in Milan. And this exhibition really helped to reawaken the world to Caravaggio. Circling back to this installation in Gallery 211, we wanted to show these beautiful loans alongside two AIC visitors to tell a bit of Caravaggio's story and the story of his time in Rome. Alongside paintings by Cecco del Caravaggio, Giovanni Baglione, and Bartolomeo Manfredi, the installation creates a dialogue that contextualizes Caravaggio's influence on the artists working in the city, while simultaneously highlighting our spectacular collection of Caravaggesque works at the Art Institute. I thank you for your attention.